All right, so I'll go ahead and read this one to you. So books about architectural works, unless they are not intended for a general audience, ought to include discussions of both the utility and the aesthetic appeal of each of the buildings they consider. So books about this, unless they are not intended for a general audience, so I gotta love that unless in there.
Yeah.
They ought to include these two things. If they do not, they are flawed. Oh, so they don't have these two things and these books are flawed. Morton's books on Italian Baroque or IB palaces describes these palaces' functional aspects, but fails to mention that the main hall of a palace he discusses at length has a ceiling that is one of the truly breathtaking masterpieces of Western art. If the statements above are true, it would be necessary to establish which of the following in order to conclude that the Morton book is flawed. So this one's kind of nice because it's telling us that our conclusion is that the Morton book is flawed. And
I
so
don't know if diagram or not though, because this does look like something we could diagram out.
you could. This is actually what I wouldn't diagram though. Well, I mean, I might because we're going to, it's easier for me to communicate with you by diagramming, but so in order to be flawed, what must something have?
Okay.
Or let's say to not be flawed. So
Oh,
something is not flawed.
Okay,
What
well
does it
then we have including utility and aesthetic appeal.
Yes.
Of each building they consider.
And they must not have, unless they are not intended for a general audience. So if they're flawed, that's like almost another variable where we're saying, so if they're not flawed, they have those two things. I guess it doesn't matter when they're not flawed. But when they are flawed, that means that they either don't have U or they don't have A, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or they are not intended for a general audience, right?
But isn't that a double negative though? Not, because we're negating.
Unless introduces are not intended for a general audience. That's what I did. I did general audience and not general audience.
Oh, I see. Okay, sorry.
No, you're fine. That's just my diagramming what I did.
No, it's okay.
So what we know about the Morton's book is that it describes these palace's functional aspects. So we have one, but we don't have the other. So what has to be true in order for it to be flawed?
That it doesn't have, let me see here. Let me just actually reread it.
Yep, no worries.
Functional aspects, but fails to mention the main hall of the palace he discusses at length has a ceiling. So we are basically missing one of those two. I think the aesthetic value. We're missing that because it fails to.
But is the aesthetic value alone enough to guarantee that it's flawed?
No, I think we're missing both actually then. The utility and the aesthetic appeal.
I think the functional aspects, we have one of them. What would so I think what we're saying is we know that it talks about the functional aspects, but it fails to discuss.
Sorry.
But I think what this is telling us is it tells us that it doesn't have the aesthetic appeal.
Okay.
So if it's telling us that we don't have one of these things, is that enough to guarantee that it's flawed? If it doesn't have one of those two things?
I think yes, I think so.
Well, what is
no.
this? This is where I think the really important part, unless they are not intended for a general audience.
So then it's not enough then, because if it's
right,
like
so
that,
if it's not flawed, so if it's not, okay, hold on, unless introduces necessary, so not intended for a general audience, but then you have to negate the sufficient. So books about, so this would be flawed. So if it is flawed, that means that it's not about a general audience, right?
Right.
So we want to prove that Morton's book is flawed. So what must be true of Morton's book is that it's not for a general audience, right? Because if it is for a general audience,
And then,
then it doesn't matter what it's included, because we have this fancy unless statement in here.
oh, I see. And then the ought to include too. I see that now.
Awesome. All right, so go ahead and start with A.
Sure. So A says that Morton's description of the palace's utility is inaccurate. I don't know if that does enough for us, so I'm just going to.
Yeah, does it need to be true that his utility is accurate for it to be flawed?
No, it just needs the general audience
That
thing.
might be sufficient for it to be flawed, but it's not needed.
Yeah, I'm gonna be honest with you, Nicole. This is still something I need to wrap my head around.
No,
As you can
you're totally no, this is a harder question. We went for a harder one for sure.
I know my wheels are a little bit rusty with this for sure. Okay, so B says that Morton's books do not discuss aspects of the palaces other than utility and aesthetic. But here's the thing: Morton's book does not discuss aspects of the palace other than. Can we maybe keep that? I don't think that it's right because it doesn't matter about the whether or not they don't discuss those things. It matters what they like, what their book, like what it's intended to
Yeah,
do.
what if it only yeah, does it not is it needed that it doesn't discuss anything other than utility and aesthetic?
No,
No,
like it
it
just
could include his biography or something. That doesn't make it flawed.
exactly. So we can eliminate B. It's just
Excellent.
not
Yes.
what we're looking for. And then C, Morton's book is intended for a general audience. There we go. That's perfect because it
Yes.
to see why that might not, be why it's flawed essentially. And it does that by basically, if we apply it to the conditions of the functional aspects and what's required of that, those things can still happen. Like we can still have those things not happen, but general audience, if it doesn't have that, then that means that that book is flawed 100% of the time
Yes.
then. Okay.
We're assuming, yes.
Yeah. Because it can't be not flawed if the general audience was intended for this reason, for this book.
Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry, my mind's just, but we could go through D and E as well, just to
Yeah.
quickly roll them off. So D says the passage discussing the palace plays a very important role in helping to establish the overall argument of Morton's book. Well, it doesn't tell us if it's flawed or not. Like it's great that it could establish that. That could still happen, but that doesn't tell us why the book is
Yeah,
flawed.
we don't care that it plays a very important role. What if the passage discussing the palace does not play an important role? Like we don't
That
care.
was okay too. Like we don't really, yeah. Okay, and then E, the palace discussed at length is one of the most aesthetically important of those treated in Morton's book. Well, that's great. Like it's still, you can
Cool,
mention
but what if
aesthetic.
it's most aesthetically pleasing? But does it matter? Like, what if it's not one of the most aesthetically important? Then who cares?
Exactly. Like it could still be correct. Like it could still be true. Like it doesn't mean that it's going to guarantee the flaw existence, right? So
Excellent.